Damaged Defenders by Shirza. Chapter 117. Steve and Loki. Steve had, quite honestly, wanted no part of trying to talk to Magneto. People like him really got up Steve's nose. Steve would never ever understand how anyone could be willing to, in essence, kill people who hadn't done a thing to deserve it. Kidnapping a kid and forcing them to die in your place, that was a level of horrifying cowardice Steve had never seen. Not even Red Skull had been that bad, and that was definitely saying something. It really didn't help that going to talk to the man meant leaving Bucky at the tower, which meant being out of line of sight of each other for the first time since the surgery to remove the crap Hydra had put in Bucky and replace his arm. Despite that, Steve had very reluctantly admitted that Charles maybe had a point when it came to trying to talk sense into Magneto. The odds the guy would get out, whether thanks to the Chitauri and Thanos, or at some other point, were ridiculously high. When that day came, it would be really nice if the guy didn't, as Tony put it, go supervillain on them. Loki had, when the subject first come up, agreed to talk to Magneto, so Steve had talked to Loki about the whens, whys, and wherefores of it. They'd both agreed that the sooner they started trying to talk sense into Magneto, the better. Depending on just how far past the deep edge Magneto was and how willing he was to see sense, they could very well need every second of time they could wrangle. Steve was actually rather grateful Loki was going. Steve was pretty straightforward. He could lie with a straight face if he absolutely had to, but he considered it an absolute last choice outside of such harmless things as card games, and was very uncomfortable with doing it. Word games were not really his thing, not using them himself and not, past a certain point, spotting them when someone else tried them. Steve didn't know how into or good at that sort of thing Magneto was, but better to be safe than sorry. Word games were pretty much Loki's bread and butter, so he'd both spot any verbal traps Magneto laid and be able to counter them. And probably trip Magneto up with a few of his own into the bargain. The jail was formidable. From what Steve had learned, the place had been built by S.H.I.E.L.D. with superpowered lawbreakers in mind, though obviously they couldn't predict every single possible superpower. They had, though, had something ready for the day when someone managed to catch Magneto, who had evidently been poking at the edges of illegal actions for a while. Long enough that people realized he'd step over the line at some point. He hadn't even bothered to try not to express his lack of being impressed when they walked into the cell. Had, in fact, quite deliberately given Magneto what the Commandos had coined the disappointed face, which, yes, the Commandos had been on the receiving end of. Normally, thanks to the hijinks they got up to when they had a bit of R&R between Hydra raids. Though there'd been a few times Steve had to pull the face out because someone got a little too reckless with their life in their zeal to wipe out Hydra. But he had never failed to be deeply amused at the irony when that happened. Steve was, well, kind of reluctantly amused at Magneto's near gushing. It wasn't unexpected. Steve might not get why people in the modern day got all starry-eyed and awed at him, but Magneto, yeah, that was a whole lot more explicable. And whatever else could be said about the man, he at least started out polite and civil. But then Red Skull had been capable of sounding like he wasn't an amoral monster too, so that wasn't saying much. To say Steve and the Commandos had been unamused when the news about the concentration camps reached them was to vastly understate the case. If it hadn't been for Red Skull and Hydra, he and the Commandos would have spent the war hunting those abominations down with extreme prejudice. As it were, they'd more or less salted the earth the times they'd run across that concentration camp while searching for Hydra bases or foiling Hydra attacks in the war. Which is to say that the worst part of this whole thing was that Magneto had a point. His belief that mankind couldn't be trusted to treat civilly with mutants wasn't based on some nonsense baloney or mental imbalance of some sort. Even if Magneto hadn't lived through the Holocaust had still happened. And while it had been notable for being the most organized and inhumane attempt at genocide, at least that Steve knew of, not to mention the one with the most deaths, it had not even come close to being the first. Steve was no more going to allow that to happen to mutants than Magneto was, really. He was still catching up on things, but he hadn't missed how mutants were generally seen and treated. Hadn't missed the fact that the X-Men, especially ones that didn't look fully human, expected trouble. The X-Men participating in the defense of the city had put a dent in that attitude, but Steve wasn't fool enough to think it had fixed the problem entirely. He figured that mutants helping to kick Thanos' butt would at least put another heavy-duty dent in the mutants' bad perception. And if it didn't, well, at that point, Steve figured he'd have time on his hands. And he'd always hated bullies. He'd happily spend the rest of his life, metaphorically, and literally where necessary, kicking people in the teeth until they saw sense or, at the very least, gave up trying to bully mutants. Still with his arms crossed over his chest and with that disappointed look on his face, Steve sat back just a little in his chair, trying not to loom. Let's put all our cards on the table, shall we? I'm pretty sure you've guessed we're here at Charles' behest, Steve said. He and Loki had agreed that Steve would, well, do what he did best. Play things straight. Use blunt honesty like the weapon it could be. Loki would do what he did best. Weave a subtle web of words around Magneto and trick him into tripping right into it. I had assumed as much, yes, Magneto agreed, though I fear his hopes are in vain. Given he expects you to be him? Pretty much, Steve agreed, then had to fight a laugh at Magneto's briefly stunned expression. Don't believe my press, Mr. Lensher. And calling him that rather than Magneto was definitely deliberate. Despite what history would have you believe, I have a long history of doing what I think is right, rather than what's expected of me. Charles Xavier might have asked me to speak to you with the assumption I'd tried to convert you to his beliefs, but Steve shrugged. I saw some of the camps, and history is rife with what humans are capable of doing when they don't like a certain group of people. Hiding in plain sight might have worked for a small number of folks in the past, but it's not viable for mutants as a whole. Large-scale placation is really not viable either, Steve said. It had worked for other groups to an extent, but the reality was that some mutants had truly terrifying abilities, and no amount of telling people, "We'll be good, honest," was going to completely relieve people's fears of such mutations. Steve almost grinned when Magneto seemed to get a little smug alongside the shocked surprise that Captain America, of all people, agreed that people in general could be horrible. Admitting that? Well, that had been sheer common sense, because sooner or later Magneto would have gotten him to say it. Best to do it now. And then hit Magneto with the heavy end of the hammer. Steve straightened from his mostly relaxed seat and uncrossed his arms. Steve's personality had always been larger than life. After the serum, his body had simply, mostly, matched that personality. Steve had always stood or sat straight and proud when he was on one of his soapboxes. It just hadn't had any impact coming from a skinny short guy that a strong wind could have knocked over. In that same body language now, backed a wallop. Steve might not understand why it did. Really, it was never going to understand the hooplas that surrounded him. But he wasn't shy about using it to his advantage. Loki was amused. Steve, for all his protestations otherwise, could and did manipulate people. Granted, it was mostly by simply being himself and letting his hilariously overblown, and in a lot of cases outright erroneous, reputation do the work for him. Still, he wasn't all that shy about doing that sort of thing for the right cause. This situation being a case in point. Like Steve, Loki was willing to admit that Magneto had a point. Loki didn't even blame the man for going as the Earth saying went off the rails in the face of what he'd suffered. Loki would be the worst sort of hypocrite if he did. But having had such a breaking point and now being beyond it, beyond, not over, two different things, Loki could admit how counterproductive actions taken in such a state could be. It was also amusing to watch Steve at work for another reason. Steve wore Captain America the way one might wear a coat. It was something necessary at certain times, but when it was not, you took it off. Loki, as a shapeshifter, had experience with that sort of thing, but it was always interesting seeing it from the outside. Steve had come here as Steve, disappointment and all. But now, having admitted that Magneto had a point, as they'd planned to do, Steve visibly shifted into Captain America. His posture straightened, the disappointed glower he'd been wearing increased tenfold, and even seated he managed to loom. He pointed a finger at Magneto in a way that succeeded in being vaguely threatening if Magneto's expression was anything to go by. That said, and even Steve's voice had changed, going a bit deeper and definitely more authoritative. Your plan is even worse than Charles. And even Sidon, the glare Steve leveled at Magneto was impressive. Do you not realize that what you're doing and what you doubtlessly plan to do in the future is killing the very people you want to save? Every time you and other mutants that think the way you do kick up a fuss, it makes things worse. The fearmongers can sit back, point to what you've done, and go, see, we told you. They're dangerous and evil and must be eliminated or controlled. Steve snapped. Every time you do that stuff, you make more people afraid of mutants. Steve continued. You make more people willing to treat mutants badly. Somehow Steve managed to loom even more without really moving other than to jab that pointing finger at Magneto with each of the next 5 words. You are making it worse. Loki watched as Magneto briefly reeled back like he'd been hit by Mjolnir. Steve had figured he might, given the existing variables. If he did, that was to be Loki's cue to step in. It was a plan not unlike the ones he and Thor had employed in the past. Thor did his best work as a blunt weapon, much like Steve. So it was easy for Loki to slot into his usual role as the slim hidden knife to Thor's massive hammer. We're not unsympathetic, Loki fairly purred. The situation facing mutants is not ideal, and while I am not as intimately familiar with the period of history the two of you lived, I do not need to be. I have faced prejudice near to that level myself. By the Norns, had he ever, more even than he'd been aware of for most of his life, given how Jotuns were spoken of in Asgard and the fact he'd not known he was one of them all that time. Loki couldn't stop the grimace of distaste that flickered across his face. Even if he could have, he wouldn't. It served his own purpose, as Magneto would assume the grimace was caused by memories of prejudice faced, rather than Loki's extreme distaste for, well, certain facts. Overt violence is the purview of lesser men, Loki purred, deliberately stressing the phrase to imply he considered Magneto to not be a lesser man, and thus capable of and expected to perform better. Men such as we know that words, properly wielded, are far more effective and the proper way to go about things. Again, stated with the implied assumption that Magneto was included in the group, bright enough to know that and use it. A people forced to bend the knee through violence remains a people unconvinced, and highly likely to revolt, Loki said, which had been the cornerstone of his plan to save Earth if Thor had picked up on something being wrong with him. Earth, subjugated by violence, would never have stopped resisting Thanos. The best part of the plan being that he hadn't had to actually do anything to enact it other than trying to conquer the planet as per Thanos' commands. It had saved him from having to tear his mind apart finding the mind control to do something about the situation. But cause those same people to believe that your cause is just and right through word and deed. Loki gave Magneto a toothy grin and spread his hands as if to say, well, there you have it. The odds that absolutely everyone would be convinced, regardless of who was doing the talking, were nil. But the right words, combined with the right actions, would convince the majority. And that was all mutants needed to avoid being wiped out. Once most people were convinced that mutants weren't a problem that needed correcting, or worse, they would protect mutants from the remaining minority. A number of groups on Earth were protected from persecution through similar actions on their parts. Not globally in most cases, to be sure, but they had still gained tolerance of their existence and protection from persecution in various areas around the realm.